In need of references for your research? Do you want a search engine that is easy to navigate? And do you want it free? If you are a student, researcher, or teacher looking for socioeconomic references and materials, then SERPI is for you. To access SERPI, just visit the PIDS website at www.pids.gov.ph and click the SERPI widget. Or type serp-p.pids.gov.ph. SERPI is an online database of socioeconomic studies and materials produced by the Philippine Institute for Development Studies and other academic and research institutions. SERPI has a wide variety of socioeconomic materials such as journal articles, books, working papers, policy notes, research papers, and newsletters. SERPI has 52 partner institutions that contribute publications to the database. SERPI has a wide coverage of materials encompassing 20 research themes. You can search by keyword or author, by publication type, by research theme, or year published. SERPI has more than 7,000 materials with full text that you can download for free. Enjoy searching! Visit SERPI now and follow us on Facebook. You may also send a message for inquiries.
Policies can either make or break a country and its people. Hence, they should be thoroughly studied and evaluated. This is where policy research comes in. Through Malacanang Proclamation 247 in 2002, the government declared the month of September as Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM. The DPRM aims to promote nationwide awareness on the importance of policy research in the formulation of evidence-based policies, plans, and programs. It also aims to cultivate a strong culture of research and research use among decision makers and raise the public's literacy on socioeconomic issues. The proclamation also designated the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, to oversee and coordinate all activities related to the DPRM. Various activities such as policy forums, press conferences, social media promotion, and the annual Public Policy Conference are organized by PIDS and its partners to celebrate the DPRM. Every year, the DPRM focuses on a particular theme, which is usually a current or an emerging development issue of national significance. For instance, the DPRM is centered on issues pertaining to regulations, risk reduction and management, decentralization, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the new globalization, and the reforms needed to address the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This 2021, to follow through on last year's theme on innovating governance for the new normal, the DPRM is focusing on the theme Reset and Rebuild for a better Philippines in the post-pandemic world. Through this theme, we wish to emphasize that to rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic and create a better Philippines, we need to reset our paradigms and practices by balancing the interests of people, profit, and planet. This means placing equal importance on economic, social, and environmental well-being and sustainability. To make this possible, the government should set the right policies that will allow all citizens, regardless of status in life, to access essential public services and will protect all segments of the population, especially the poor and the vulnerable, from various risks through effective social protection systems. The business sector, for its part, should explore ways and areas where it can be both profitable and socially responsible. Business owners and operators should embrace decent work principles, provide the best service to their customers, and care for the well-being of their employees, the community, and the environment. Meanwhile, the civil society should continue reaching out to sectors that do not have access to government channels. It should also strengthen its advocacy for more accountable and responsive governance and more sustainable business practices. The academe also has an important role to play. It should ensure that the new modes of delivering education and training under the new normal are accessible to all and will not widen economic and social inequalities. As individual citizens, we also need to start living more responsibly by adopting more sustainable lifestyles. We should start the reset and rebuild agenda with ourselves to effectively influence others. Collectively, we all need to work together. The government, business sector, academe, civil society, and the general public should join forces in pursuing a shared vision of an equitable, sustainable, and resilient post-pandemic Philippines. Know more about the DPRM and how you can participate by visiting its website.
Dapat po munang alamin or matukoy ang pangunahing problema ng bansa upang mapagtuunan ng pansin at mabigyan ng solusyon.
We should have specific goals, do research, and make a policy that is fair for everyone.
Walang problema sa pulisiya. Iayos lang ang pagpapatupad.
Bago patubas ang batas, pag-aralan muna gusto ng government.
Two things, clarity and execution. Both, you need the communication and monitoring. As simple as that.
Mandato ng Philippine Institute for Development Studies o PIDS na gumawa ng mga pag-aaral at pananaliksik ng mga polisiya at programa ng pamahalaan at magbigay ng rekomendasyon sa mga mambabatas sa pagbabalangkas ng mga polisiyang makakatulong sa ating bansa. Sinusulong ng aming ahensya ang evidence-based policy making upang bigyan din ng kahalagahan ng polisiya na batay sa datos at policy research na sumusuri sa tunay na kalagayan ng ating mga komunidad. Napakahalaga ng policy research, lalo na sa mga panahong dumadaan sa krisis ang ating bansa.
Kapag polisiya ay pinag-aralan, susulong ang bayan.
Policies can either make or break a country and its people. Hence, they should be thoroughly studied and evaluated. This is where policy research comes in. Through Malacanang Proclamation 247 in 2002, the government declared the month of September as Development Policy Research Month or DPRM. The DPRM aims to promote nationwide awareness on the importance of policy research in the formulation of evidence-based policies, plans, and programs. It also aims to cultivate a strong culture of research and research use among decision makers and raise the public's literacy on socio-economic issues. The proclamation also designated the Philippine Institute for Development Studies or PIDS to oversee and coordinate all activities related to the DPRM. Various activities such as policy forums, press conferences, social media promotion, and the annual Public Policy Conference are organized by PIDS and its partners to celebrate the DPRM. Every year, the DPRM focuses on a particular theme which is usually a current or an emerging development issue of national significance. For instance, the DPRM is centered on issues pertaining to regulations, risk reduction and management, decentralization, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the new globalization, and the reforms needed to address the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. This 2021, to follow through on last year's theme on innovating governance for the new normal, the DPRM is focusing on the theme Reset and Rebuild for a better Philippines in the post-pandemic world. Through this theme, we wish to emphasize that to rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic and create a better Philippines, we need to reset our paradigms and practices by balancing the interests of people, profit, and planet. This means placing equal importance on economic, social, and environmental well-being and sustainability. To make this possible, the government should set the right policies that will allow all citizens, regardless of status in life, to access essential public services and will protect all segments of the population, especially the poor and the vulnerable, from various risks through effective social protection systems. The business sector, for its part, should explore ways and areas where it can be both profitable and socially responsible. Business owners and operators should embrace decent work principles, provide the best service to their customers, and care for the well-being of their employees, the community, and the environment. Meanwhile, the civil society should continue reaching out to sectors that do not have access to government channels. It should also strengthen its advocacy for more accountable and responsive governance and more sustainable business practices. The academe also has an important role to play. It should ensure that the new modes of delivering education and training under the new normal are accessible to all and will not widen economic and social inequalities. As individual citizens, we also need to start living more responsibly by adopting more sustainable lifestyles. We should start the reset and rebuild agenda with ourselves to effectively influence others. Collectively, we all need to work together. The government, business sector, academe, civil society, and the general public should join forces in pursuing a shared vision of an equitable, sustainable, and resilient post-pandemic Philippines. Know more about the DPRM and how you can participate by visiting its website.
Dapat po munang alamin or matukoy ang pangunahing problema ng bansa upang mapagtuunan ng pansin at mabigyan ng solusyon.
We should have specific goals, do research, and make a policy that is fair for everyone.
Walang problema sa pulisiya. Iayos lang ang pagpapatupad.
Bago patubas ang batas, pag-aralan muna gusto ng government.
Two things, clarity and execution. Both, you need the communication and monitoring. As simple as that.
Mandato ng Philippine Institute for Development Studies o PIDS na gumawa ng mga pag-aaral at pananaliksik ng mga pulisiya at programa ng pamahalaan at magbigay ng rekomendasyon sa mga mambabatas sa pagbabalangkas ng mga pulisiyang makakatulong sa ating bansa. Sinusulong ng aming ahensya ang evidence-based policy making upang bigyan din ng kahalagahan ng pulisiya na batay sa datos at policy research na sumusuri sa tunay na kalagayan ng ating mga komunidad. Napakahalaga ng policy research, lalo na sa mga panahong dumadaan sa krisis ang ating bansa.
Kapag pulisiya ay pinag-aralan, susulong ang bayan.
Welcome to the PIDS webinar series. Before we start the webinar, we would like to give you a few reminders. For attendees, your microphone is muted upon entry. In case you have a question, the moderator will read it during the open forum. For those attending via Cisco WebEx, use the chat box located at the lower part of the screen. Click the chat icon, Type your name and affiliation and your question and send to all panelists. You may send your questions while the presentation is in progress. The moderator will read them during the open forum. For Facebook viewers, at least 2 questions from the comment section will be read by the moderator during the open forum. We will moderate all questions to ensure that they are relevant to the scope of the presentation. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your active participation.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. This is Margarita, Debuque-Gonzales, Maggie. Welcome to the second day of our 7th annual Public Policy Conference. The theme this year is Reset and Rebuild for a Better Philippines in a Post-Pandemic World. We had a kickoff webinar a couple of days ago on resetting capitalism. The main speaker for that webinar was University of Chicago financial economist and professor Luigi Zingales, one of the leading thinkers in this area globally. So we were really very fortunate to hear his insights on the topic. So I just like to ask for a little forbearance. I just like to give a little background so that the audience can also sort of tune in to what we are talking about. So Professor Zingales gave us the crash course last time on resetting capitalism. And this webinar is like part 2 of that webinar. And we have chosen to call this session Ethical Business. So I have to put the quotation marks, ethical business. We need to define what ethical business is. I guess that's one thing. So it's a provocative topic, provocative title. It is really meant to make people think. It's not to judge business, big business, or the business sector or business leaders, but it's really to make people think about how things can change for the better. So like what one would normally do in TV or in movies, if you have a part 2, you have to give a quick summary of the part 1. So just to recall, the movement to reset capital, as we know, is largely due to the pandemic. It was a time when we saw deep unemployment, a lot of inequality, pervasive hunger, a lot of left behind communities. But on the positive side, we also saw a lot of goodness, a lot of compassion, a lot of nobility, even from our business leaders, with many companies stepping in a bayanihan way to help not just their own workers, but also vulnerable communities, vulnerable sectors, and even help government itself. But the movement actually started before the COVID-19 pandemic in 2019, year 2019. The US Business Roundtable already released a new statement of purpose of a corporation where they said that the fundamental commitment is not just to the shareholder, but to all stakeholders. So the stakeholders here are your workers, your suppliers, your creditors, the communities that are, let's say, around your factories, and even the environment and even government by paying the proper taxes and following the law. So US Business Roundtable was followed by the World Economic Forum, which called for a great reset in 2020. And they also called for a shift away from shareholder capitalism and toward stakeholder capitalism, the heart of which are the 3 Ps, progress, people, and planet. So not just profit, also the people and the planet. Here in the Philippines, in November 2020, the Philippine Business Group, which consisted of 20 business or associations in the country, led by the Management Association of the Philippines, also signed what they called a covenant for shared prosperity. And same thing, business leaders said that they were vowing to raise the welfare of all the stakeholders of their businesses. So this is a momentous event because it seemed to mark a shift away from shareholder capitalism, where the goal is to maximize profits of the shareholder, and towards stakeholder capitalism, where the goal is to maximize the long-term value of the firm. So this is a big shift because for 50 years we were ruled by the Friedman Doctrine, which basically this is the title of the article that Friedman wrote 50 years ago, which basically said that the social responsibility of the business is to increase its profits. And that article became the core of what people like to call now shareholder theory. So a few days ago, just to summarize, Professor Zingales talked about the assumptions that needed to hold for Friedman to be correct. And he said basically you need perfect competition, perfect markets, no externalities, agents caring only about money, business caring only about profits, everybody having complete contracts, meaning all your workers, suppliers, and credits have complete contracts. They are compensated correctly. There's no uncertainty about their compensation, et cetera, et cetera. Which means that the only one bearing the risk in the whole equation now is the shareholder, and that's why you give him protection, and that's why you give him the corporate vote. Okay, so he said that the Friedman Doctrine is really just the first welfare theory of economics, which says that a competitive equilibrium is a Pareto optimal equilibrium. In English, in layman terms, it says if you have competitive markets, you have competition among players in the market, then what you get as an outcome in your economy is already the best, the socially optimal outcome. Okay, so and he said that that holds for small corporations with the help of stockholder voting, but it may not hold for really, really large corporations where he feels that there should be a fiduciary role, extra role that is now meant to protect society as a whole. So this is where the debate stands. The question is, should we stick to shareholder capitalism religiously, or should we shift to stakeholder capitalism? This is not a no-brainer because we all know that shareholder capitalism also has a lot of benefits. It gives you clearer accountability for your corporate executives, as Mr. Romeo Bernardo emphasized in the last webinar. It gives corporate directors a clear guideline as to how to make their decisions. And we have seen this kind of capitalism actually work for a lot of countries. It has lifted people out of poverty by raising profits and building up corporate performance. Okay, so it has done a lot of good. But we are evolving and we've run across pandemics, we've had hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and there's a clamor for kinder capitalism. And that's what we are trying to discuss, what we want to discuss today. And I just like to mention that there are credible business influencers out there like McKinsey and Company, and they're actually saying, so McKinsey and Company is a leading global consultancy firm, and they're saying that stakeholderism, holding stakeholder values, serving your stakeholders is now a quote unquote ethical good. Okay, so we go back to the definition of ethical. So they're saying that if you are able to deliver this ethical good, then you have a competitive advantage. And this was also mentioned by Mr. Periquet in the other webinar, where power companies that have high ESG scores are favored by the market, which we will ask our speakers to confirm or not. Okay, so going back, we define ethical business. We need to define ethical business. And so here we define it really as business that is not just dedicated to profits, but one that has a higher social purpose. So I'm happy to say that we will be discussing a very interesting area with a new set of carefully picked speakers who will help us see how global businesses have been evolving and how domestic businesses have also been evolving. I hope I have given enough background and drummed up some interest in the topic. Thank you for bearing with me. Before we jump into this lively conversation, I don't want to call it a debate. Let's first hear from our dearest President of the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, Dr. Aniceto Orbeta. Sir.
Good morning, everyone. Let me start by acknowledging the presence of the following in the webinar. From the government, we have the National Economic Development Authority Assistant Secretary Greg Pineda. We have from Department of Labor and Employment Undersecretary Benjo Benavides, Department of Labor and Employment Assistant Secretary Alex Avila, Department of Foreign Affairs Assistant Secretary Gina Hamuralin, Assistant Secretary Maria Lourdes Duarte, Assistant Secretary and Director General of APPC, Philippine National Secretariat Eric Tamayo, National Privacy Commission Deputy Privacy Commissioner John Henry Naga, the Philippine Statistical Research and Training Institute Executive Director Josefina Almeda, Senate Economic Planning Office Executive Director Merwin Salazar, directors, assistant and deputy directors and regional directors and other officials of the House of Representatives, National Economic Development Authority, Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Interior and Local Government, Civil Service Commission, the Department of Trade and Industry, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, the Philippine Information Agency, the Cooperative Development Authority, the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, the Board of Investments, Department of Energy, the Bangsamoro Development Agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and other government agencies who are with us today. From the PIDS itself, we have the board member, Dr. Gilbert Yanto. From the private sector, we have the Lazaro Bernardo Chu, Associate President and Managing Director, the Management Association of the Philippines, and Phoenix Foundation Board Director and Board Director of Publicly Listed Companies, Romeo Bernardo. From the social welfare stations, we have Chairman Emeritus Mahar Mangahas, Amihan Global Strategies Philippines Incorporated President Jerry Rapes. From the academy, let me acknowledge the following: the Cagayan State University President Orduha Alvarado, Silliman University Vice President for Development Jane Annette Villarmino, Pamantasan ng Kabuya Vice President for Research and Extension Virginia Bautista, University of the Philippines School of Business Dean Joel Tan Torres, Notre Dame University Dean Ronald Mamarel, University of Mindanao School of Management Dean Aurelia Los Biminda Gomez, De La Salle University Dean Marites Chonco, Aklan State University Dean Benedict Bombais, directors and other officials from the Cagayan State University, University of San Carlos, University of Southeastern Philippines, Central Bicol State University, University of the Visayas, and other universities and colleges who are with us this morning. From the CSOs and NGOs and INGOs, we have the United Nations Industrial Development Organization Country Representative Teddy Monroy, the Philippine Embassy in Paris First Secretary and Consul Christina McKernan, and Institute of Corporate Directors Trustee Alfredo Pascual, Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy President Amina Rasol Bernardo, Blas Opli Policy Center and Training Institute Executive Director Jerome Alcantara, Lawig PH Incorporated Founder, Philippine President and Executive Director Richelle Dayan Claros, PhilCode Program Director Jamil Raton, na Masaganang Sakahan Incorporated Director Daniel Agustin. Let me greet also our friends from the media. And finally, let me greet as well those who are watching through the PIDS and CERP Facebook pages. Good morning and welcome to the second of the four-part webinar series of the Annual Public Policy Conference, or APPC. The APPC is the highlight of the Development Policy Research Month, or the PRM, led by PIDS every September to underscore the importance of policy research in crafting evidence-based plans, policies, and programs. This year's the PRM theme, as Maggie mentioned, this is also the theme of the APPC, is Reset and Rebuild for a Better Philippines in the Post-Pandemic World, or in Filipino, muling magsimula at magtayo tungo sa mas matatag na Pilipinas pagkatapos ng pandemya. The theme relays the message that to be able to rebuild from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to reset our paradigms and practices by balancing the interests of people, profit, and planet, or by placing equal importance on economic, social, and environmental well-being and sustainability. In today's webinar, we will talk about ethical business, in quotation marks. Specifically, we will unpack the concept of stakeholder capitalism, which prioritizes stakeholders' interests, including employees, customers, suppliers, and the community. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck, businesses were the first to be heavily affected by lockdowns and quarantine restrictions. As a result, many firms shut down and reduced their operations, which resulted in massive unemployment in many areas. A World Bank survey on the Philippine firms conducted in November 2020 stated that 67% of firms reported a reduction in sales between July and November 2020. The main reason for the decreased sales is the limited operations and inability of customers to come to establishments due to quarantine restrictions imposed all over the country. The survey also revealed that a large share of firms reported acute liquidity constraints with reports of not having enough cash and have fallen behind payments. 66% of firms did not have enough cash to pay for all costs and payments such as payroll, suppliers, taxes, or loan repayment beyond 1 month. Moreover, many of these firms expected their financial positions to worsen as the pandemic continues. An Asian Development Bank working paper examining the initial 1-month impact of the pandemic on micro, small, and medium enterprises, or MSMEs, in the Philippines after the lockdown began showed that some MSMEs were badly affected while others have benefited. The study found that education, construction, accommodation, and food services, including tourism and manufacturing, were the most affected, while power and energy, information and communications technology, and real estate cope better. Amid all this, the pandemic has also tested the commitment of businesses to their employees and immediate communities to help them cope with the pandemic. Many companies have proactively engaged in socially beneficial activities to demonstrate that they are one with the people in fighting the crisis. For instance, in the United Kingdom, manufacturing companies transformed their factories to produce ventilators, personal protective equipment, and hand sanitizers. At the same time, some of them donated these products instead of selling them. Also, one of the major telecommunications companies provided free access to unlimited mobile data for many of its monthly pay customers and upgraded its vulnerable monthly pay customers to unlimited data for free. Their supermarkets also allocated opening hours for the elderly and donated Easter eggs and foodstuffs to food banks and charitable organizations, while banks waive interest on overdrafts over some time. In the Philippines, SM supermalls cut the rental fees of their tenants to support them during the pandemic. The Ayala Corporation, on the other hand, spearheaded the project that distributed emergency food packages, shopping vouchers, and medical assistance to families. These are just some of the examples of ethical business practices amid this pandemic. To give us a broader perspective on the topic at hand, we invited PayPal Incorporated Head of the Global Public Policy, Mr. Usman Ahmed, to share a case study on PayPal's practice of stakeholder capitalism. We have also invited the University of the Philippines retired professor of economics and management, Dr. Necito S. Poblador, to discuss some of the unsettled issues in ethical business. The insights of the private sector will enrich the presentations of our speakers. We are privileged to have Ms. April Lee Tan, the first Vice President of the Corporate Strategy and Chief Investor Relations Officer of CUL Financial Group Incorporated, to share her views on the topic. Of course, this webinar will not be complete without hearing the side of nonprofit organization that practices ethical governance. We are honored to have the Institute of Corporate Directors Chairperson of the Board of Trustees, Atty. Cesar Villanueva. To our speakers and panelists, thank you for taking time to join us in today's webinar. Finally, I would like to especially thank the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, or BSP, for partnering with PIDS once again in the conduct of the APPC. BSP's generous support enables PIDS to tap the expertise of respected local and international speakers for this annual conference. To our participants, I hope you will stay with us until the end of the webinar and look forward to your active participation during the open forum. In closing, let us watch this video which sums up the message of this year's DPRM and APPC theme. Thank you and good day.
Almost 2 years into the COVID-19 pandemic, nations all over the world are still grappling to address its impacts. In the Philippines, the pandemic has had an overwhelming effect on poverty and inequality, with certain groups more affected than others. Until now, people are forced to stay at home. Businesses which are already struggling to recover still have no choice but to halt their operations from time to time. And students are still finding ways to adjust to the new modes of learning, with physical classes still being prohibited. The crisis has strained health systems, exposing long-standing gaps in public health, and revealed major gaps in the current social protection systems. The pandemic has worsened existing environmental problems that the country faces due to the surge in the volume of wastes. Making matters worse are the new and more transmissible variants of the virus, causing more hospitalizations and deaths. Even countries that were initially successful in instituting protocols are once again scrambling to adjust their strategies. Most people ask, is there an end in sight? How can we move forward and recover from this crisis? It is about time that we reset our systems and start anew. Resetting means clearing errors and removing problematic parts, then rebuilding them by making the necessary improvements or by creating new ones so that we could come out of this pandemic better and stronger.
Inspired by the World Economic Forum's call for the Great Reset, the Philippine Institute for Development Studies, or PIDS, is initiating a much-needed discussion on resetting our paradigms to rebuild our country toward an equitable, sustainable, resilient, post-pandemic future for all Filipinos. Through the annual Public Policy Conference, or APPC, which is the main and culminating activity of the Development Policy Research Month, or DPRM, we wish to open the conversation on how we can pursue this reset and rebuild agenda in our respective sectors.
To rebuild the country from the COVID-19 pandemic, we need to reset our paradigms and practices by balancing the interests of people, profit, and planet. Everyone has a role to play. A caring and compassionate business sector is crucial. This means placing equal importance on economic, social, and environmental well-being and sustainability. The academe should ensure that the new modes of delivering education and training under the new normal are accessible to all and will not widen economic and social inequalities. Schools should also improve their curriculum by imparting knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes that promote social responsibility and environmental stewardship. Civil society must be relentless in pushing for a more accountable and responsive governance and sustainable business practices, and bridge the gap between sectors that do not have access to government channels. Climate change has already severely affected the livelihood of most Filipinos, and the COVID-19 pandemic just worsened the situation. There is a need to strengthen measures to protect the environment and adopt climate resilience programs that will pave the way for a greener and bluer economy. The government must focus on setting the right policies to address the needs of the times. It must also improve the country's emergency preparedness, response, recovery, and rehabilitation. Lastly, the general public should reset its paradigms by adopting new practices at work, in learning, and in leisure that will help build resilience to adversities. Everyone must start living more responsibly by adopting more sustainable lifestyles.
Individually, we should build our resilience so that collectively we can be stronger as a nation, ready to fight the next crisis. Overcoming the current pandemic requires a whole-of-society approach driven by solidarity and compassion, and guided by data and evidence.
Together, let us work toward a more caring business, a more nurtured environment, a more resilient, more inclusive, and more sustainable economy. Let us reset and rebuild for a better Philippines.
Before we proceed, can we kindly ask everybody, the speakers and the panelists, to turn on their videos for photo op, for a photo taking, official photo taking. Miss April? April? There, thank you.
Okay po, thank you, Miss Maggie. Okay, so put on your best smile. Okay. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, one more time. Okay. Mr. Usman, if you could just go closer to your screen. Okay, there you go. Okay, put on your best smile. Dr. Poblador, are you ready? Okay. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay, thank you po, Miss Maggie.
Okay, can I start? So for our first speaker, we have Mr. Usman Ahmed. He is the head of the Global Public Policy Center at PayPal Inc. Mr. Ahmed, Professor Ahmed pala, is also an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University Law School. His research has been published in the Cambridge Press World Trade Review, the MIT Press Innovations Journal, and in the Boston University International Law Journal. His research has also been cited in articles appearing in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Straits Times, USA Today, and the Detroit Free Press. He is a Millennium Fellow at the Atlantic Council and a Security Fellow at the Truman National Security Project. Mr. Ahmed, Professor Ahmed, earned his JD from University of Michigan, his master's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and his BA from the University of Maryland. You have the screen, Mr. Ahmed.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I think somebody needs to allow me to share my my other screen. As soon as that happens, and I'll. Oh, there we go. Thank you. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that. And thank you, Dr. Debuque-Gonzales. I didn't know you were going to do such an incredible overview of the topic. So hopefully I'll be a little quicker so we can get into the discussion, which I think will be useful. But I did most of my presentation is around, as you mentioned, kind of PayPal's own journey towards this topic of stakeholder capitalism. But I had thought, since I was the first speaker, I would give a little bit of background, and I think it's useful because I think I have a slightly different perspective than my friend and colleague, Professor Gonzales, who I've known and worked with for many years, and I think it's important to have a somewhat shared historical background for all of this, and I actually, I want to start with. We're going to spend most of our time talking about stakeholder versus shareholder. And the different models for capitalism, but I also want to put us all on an even playing field when we're talking about capitalism itself, because certainly many academics and experts on this call, we might have a very nuanced definition of the term capitalism, but I think when we use this word, most people evoke kind of a giant city like Manila and huge investment banks that are putting billions of dollars into infrastructure projects, and that's the view of what capitalism is, and it certainly is an element of modern capitalism. But I'd love to ground us in kind of what this concept is about, and I'd argue that it's probably as old as human beings. And my hypothesis, a little bit of my professorial hat, is like the first form of capitalism was a farmer who that year had a higher yield than they were expecting and saved up some of their rice or corn or whatever they were growing and sold it for some extra money, and then invested in their neighbor's farm to hope that the yield from their neighbor's farm might produce some extra yield, and therefore they would benefit without having to plant the food themselves. Like that's, it's simplistic, but I think it really is that simple. It really is that concept, and it's obviously burgeoned and grown, and it's this big global phenomenon that underlies almost every interaction we have, every economic interaction. But it really does start at that core concept, and I just want to ground everyone in that notion. And so what we're talking about today, I think, is the modern corporation and its use of this topic of capitalism. And I would argue that the modern history of this probably dates back to this gentleman here. Like you mentioned, Dr. Debuque-Gonzales and Dr. Poblador, about the COVID pandemic just raising this question of what is the role of corporations. But this gentleman on the screen here, Andrew Carnegie, is really made his, was born and made his fortune in the 1800s and early 1900s through oil, Standard Oil, a company I'm sure all of you have heard of. And for most of his life, I would imagine he would be what most would think of as kind of like a classical capitalist. But late in his life, he very much changed that approach and wrote a book called The Gospel of Wealth, and very much said, I don't need this much money, and so I'm going to give it all away. And so a lot of people think of that as philanthropic and that is separate from the discussion. But I would argue this is actually the moment where this discussion of what is the role of the corporation started to really take shape. Was, is it just to make the CEO and the investors all the money for them to hold on to that money and for nobody else to really benefit but those who chose to invest, or that there's a broader societal responsibility for corporates and corporate leaders? But again, a lot of this was philanthropic in nature, and so there was a development in this space, and hopefully this is useful history. George Eastman, the CEO of Kodak, the camera company, started investing in his workers in the 30s and 40s and created profit sharing programs, and those might seem like what we're talking about today in terms of stakeholder capitalism, but they were being practiced in the 30s and 40s. And then, as Dr. Debuque-Gonzales kind of noted, there was this response to all of these corporate leaders saying, yes, we should take care of our employees, we should invest in our communities, we should engage in broader societal issues, Milton Friedman. And I also want to quibble again with Professor Gonzales's description of the Friedman doctrine. I don't think it's quite so aggressive as it comes out today, meaning like, corporate leaders should just be greedy and shouldn't care about anything but themselves and their own shareholders. I think his argument, and I'd be curious for Professor Poblador's next presentation, I think his argument is that it's a better society when governments and nonprofits and other stakeholders are caring for society, and corporate leaders very much should care about society too. But when you decide, when a group of people come together based upon economic interest to form this new type of organization called a corporation as shareholders and design it in that way, then the interest of that entity, the only reason they created that entity was to make profit. And so that's what it should do. And so I think we should have a discussion about what Professor Friedman actually says, but that's my reading of it, is not quite so aggressive. But I also think most of the modern discussion and, again, the academic literature responded quite a bit to that, to the Friedman doctrine, particularly in the 90s and 2000s. And then you had this group of corporate leaders who really started to take it up, and we heard about the BRT and the World Economic Forum and all of this. And now it's kind of this emerging consensus, I would argue, that that there's more responsibility. It's, Professor Friedman, even if you take his most narrow reading, that corporations are just designed to serve the shareholders, but others should serve society. No, they're modern leaders. This is Larry Fink, CEO of the biggest private equity fund in the world. Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation, and Lynn Rothschild. Three prominent corporate leaders who are all saying, no, it's not just that. We didn't just form these organizations to solely pursue profit for the shareholders. We actually formed them to do good in the world. They have a purpose, and they should have a purpose, and they should pursue that purpose, and that purpose should be societally aligned. So hopefully, again, I want to focus most of this presentation on PayPal's story in this, and we really pick up in this latest phase of this history. But I wanted to provide that background because even though it was so well described by Professor Debuque-Gonzales, I did just want to go through that a little bit. And again, we can have a discussion on how accurately I described that history. But when it comes to PayPal, I think I have a pretty good sense of what's been going on there, because actually, interestingly, I've been at PayPal for about over a decade. But our journey on stakeholder capitalism actually only really goes back about 6 years, when PayPal spun off from eBay and became an independent company. Actually, since I'm giving the talk, I want to stand, so I'll make it feel like it's more like we're actually in a physical environment. And hopefully, I wanted to also thank the organizers and thank PIDS, and I would love to at some point join you all in the Philippines for next year's conference. But as I said, PayPal really started on this journey 6 years ago. We spun off from eBay, and we very much looked at all of our practices and said, you know what, this model of stakeholder capitalism is something we're going to put at the center of the company. We're going to put purpose, and our purpose is defined as democratizing financial services and improving financial health of consumers and businesses, in particular small businesses. And we're going to, pursue that with a long-term view. And so, we put out this statement very, to our own investors. These slides were shown to our investors that, look, we're going to shift our strategy. We now believe that profits and purpose are, centrally tied, and that we are a stakeholder-driven company. Our leadership team is actually going to consider all the stakeholders that everybody's laid out, our employees, our customers, our stockholders. And the next step from kind of, because again, the rest of this presentation, I just want to talk about our journey and how we have approached this since we made this decision. I'm sure you've heard it's a very common phrase in the technology world that you have to measure what matters, right? And you all have talked about the importance of data too. So we had to really understand, and we did a very deep dive quantitative and qualitative analysis of what are the issues in the world, because there are, unfortunately, and certainly since COVID, an unbelievable amount of issues that the world needs to care about, and there are problems to be solved. But with our structure, with our mission, vision, values, what are the areas that we can have the biggest impact on? Just like you would do a market analysis of where you would want to focus your products and your investments. And we call that in this slide like an environmental social governance map, but really it's not just about corporate stands or using our brand to engage in issues around diversity, but it's also this map informs also our business decisions and our products and services. And that's what I want to walk through in the rest of my short presentation, is how we actually went from this high-level vision of stakeholder capitalism, then this analysis of where in the world and in society do we think we can make a difference, and then what did we actually do? Where did we go? And our first, our CEO likes to say, and many CEOs are saying this now, that your first and primary stakeholder is your employees. Because if you take care of your employees, they'll take care of your customers, and your customers are part of your society and your community, and they'll take care of the community, and you'll take care of your governments and your regulators, and then that will ultimately take care of your shareholders. And so what we found when we started digging into our employees, including actually a very large group of our employees are in the Philippines, that despite the fact that we were paying above market rates in every single market that we operated in, our employees were still struggling to have any money left at the end of the month for any emergencies or savings for the long term, or savings for their kids. We call that concept net disposable income. And so we said, we did an analysis of all of our employees around the world, and we found that they only had 4% of their paycheck left over at the end of the month for any kind of unforeseen things or to invest in their savings or their future. And so we said, let's set that goal. Let's set a goal of 20%. Again, our employees were not, marching in the streets or asking us to do this. We just said, this is an important stakeholder that we care about as a corporation. They're central to our success. Let's make sure we're taking care of them. And so we unilaterally raised wages, we lowered healthcare costs, we made every single eligible employee a stockholder. We kind of expanded and our employee relief fund if there was an emergency where we could help. And then we offered education and financial counseling services. And so, very proud to say that, again, we started at 4%. We're now at 18% globally, very close to our goal of 20%. And that's meaningful. That's savings for college. That's being able to deal with a healthcare emergency for the everyday employee. That's where we wanted to begin our focus, was on the employees, but it expanded from there and expanded really to broader society. And Dr. Debuque-Gonzales talked about the environment, which is certainly central to probably the biggest shared global problem that we're all thinking about and working on. And so we made a commitment to net zero emissions by 2040. Certainly, hate speech has become a huge societal issue around the world, and so we made a commitment around combating, in particular in the United States, this issue of white supremacy. And then also again in the United States, we've been, and in particular in countries where there's democracy, we've been a strong proponent of that democracy, and so we've been pushing in cities, in particular in the U.S., for voting rights. And so again, these are not issues that show up on the balance sheet and that might get reported to an accountant, but they are societal issues. They're ones that our company on our ESG materiality map cares about and has the ability to engage on, and so we chose to engage. And lastly, there was a racial reckoning in the United States and really around the world. And so we committed over $535 million in investments. This is not philanthropy. These were investments in underserved communities, to invest in small businesses, which we heard about, to invest in startups, to really kind of build up a community that for many, many years has been underserved. And then also on the kind of social front, Asian Americans were being discriminated against quite a bit, unfortunately, due to COVID. And so again, we stood with that community and made investments and partnerships around civil rights. So, again, this is our exemplar of stakeholder capitalism, but it doesn't just limit itself to investments, business decisions, corporate decisions. It actually embeds into our products and services. And so let me finish up here with a few data points and studies that we've done. We heard about the importance of small businesses to economies, and small businesses have traditionally been a very underserved community. And what we've found in our research around the world is the small business, we have 27 million businesses around the world. The vast majority of them are small businesses. And what we find is that when businesses use our platform, small businesses all around the world, they export more, they grow faster, they survive longer. It's just a really strong, good story of how our products and services targeted to these communities are able to really lift them up. And again, that's leveraging those products and services to serve a key stakeholder that our shareholders might be, interested in the largest merchants, but there's this huge community that's underserved that we can really target. Similarly, remittances, which certainly the Philippines is a huge remittance corridor, huge societal global problem with migration, refugees, trying to send money back home, very, very high costs. If any of you have ever had to send money to loved ones, And we were able to cut those costs in half with our Zoom and our PayPal products and digitization, right? And that could have tremendous impact on low and moderate income communities. And it's not just about the money that is saved when you talk about remittances, it's about time. Again, if any of you have had to send money to loved ones, you typically have to walk to a physical location and fill out paperwork and then send it, and it takes a long time to get to the other side of the world. That digital technology that we have spent 2 decades working on has been incredibly, I shouldn't say insanely, incredibly beneficial to people's lives in terms of saving them time and money. And lastly, I just want to come back to philanthropy, because we might think of philanthropy as a separate bucket, not really, even if you're a shareholder capitalist, you're okay with businesses engaging in philanthropy. But I'd argue that there's actually a capitalist issue with philanthropies. Philanthropies have to process payments, and often a lot of money is lost when they're accepting those payments and trying to deploy them to their donees. And so again, when we studied what happens when our products and services plug in, or we target and plug in to charities, we're saving them 25%. 25% of that payment cost is then going on to the donee. It's not that we're taking it into our pockets. It's that it's actually going and benefiting the actual societal issue that charity is focused on. And so those are all just kind of case study examples of products and services that our company is focused on due to our mission and vision and stakeholder value approach that have really had meaningful stakeholder impact. I want to end with the notion that while I've focused this whole presentation on what we've done for our stakeholders, I've left one out. I talked about employees, I've talked about customers, communities, underserved. I haven't talked about shareholders. And I think Professor Debuque-Gonzales mentioned this, like, what we found is actually our shareholders are incredibly well served because we have adopted this stakeholder view. In those last 5 years that we've been reporting, since we made this shift, our revenues have doubled, our earnings per share have tripled, our operating margin has increased by 400 bips or 4%, our free cash flow has tripled, our market cap has multiplied by 7, and that's actually gone even further up. So shareholders have been very, very well served during this time that we've made this tremendous shift. So I want to end with that, and one last point, which is that this is an expectation now. Millennials in particular, young people, they are expecting companies to do this. So it's not just that it's good for society and that it's actually good for the shareholders, it's that, and it's the right thing to do, it's that people are expecting this now. This is now the norm. And so I'm really looking forward to Professor Poblador's presentation, and certainly there's a counterpoint to all of this. But our experience is that this responsibility that comes from being stakeholder capitalist is actually an opportunity, and it's actually been tremendously successful and beneficial for all of the stakeholders that we touch. So let me stop there, and very much look forward to the discussion. Professor, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you very much for that very stimulating discussion, very interesting discussion. I myself have a lot of questions in my head, and there are a lot of questions already in the chat box. But before that, let's introduce first our next speaker, Dr. Necito S. Poblador. Dr. Poblador is a former professor of economics and management at the University of the Philippines. He received his PhD in business and applied economics at the University of Pennsylvania. His areas of specialization and interest are the economics of knowledge, knowledge management, managerial economics, and management of complex systems, and organization theory. He has published widely and authored several books and journal articles. Among his recent works are Responding to Emergent Global Challenges and The Strategy Demythicized, Why Today's Business Models failed to deliver. Both books are published by the Management Association of the Philippines. He also recently wrote an article on non-inclusive growth, the profit motive, and the case for inclusive business, published at the Philippine Review of Economics in 2017. You may start now with Dr. Poblador.
I start now?
Yes, you may start now, sir.
Oh, okay. Well, good morning. Let me express my thanks to PIDS and the other organizations and individuals who helped organize this forum for giving me this opportunity to share my views on this timely but somewhat controversial topic. Let me now stop my video so I can go to my presentation. Parts of my presentation, by the way, have been extracted from my book, Strategy in the New Age of Capitalism, which is forthcoming from the University of the Philippines Press. Now, if you may please excuse me for the next 15 to 20 minutes while I make my brief presentation. Okay. The title of this webinar, Ethical Business, implicitly poses the question, are business organizations morally bound to serve the needs of society? It is widely held that business has a moral obligation to serve the needs of society, a view which is consistent with current thinking on corporate social responsibility. This popular concept of CSR stands in stark contrast with the notion made popular by economist Milton Friedman that business has no responsibility other than to make a profit. Our position on this issue is quite straightforward. We take the unconventional view that business corporations are institutions created by society to perform specific functions for the community. Institutions, business firms included, have no moral responsibility to serve the interests of others. They are ethically neutral. Business organizations are a form of social constructs. Social constructs evolve as a result of human interaction for the purpose of performing specific functions for society. The role of business firms is to create economic value. The role of religious organizations is to attend to the spiritual needs of the community, and that of the military is to protect the nation from external threats. However, the individuals that comprise institutions are morally committed to serve the interests of others. Unlike institutions, people in institutions have values. They have a sense of what is right and what is wrong, of what is good, of what is bad. They make value judgments and behave accordingly. Nonetheless, there are some members of institutions who, while holding values of their own, are duty-bound to serve the interest of their organizations. For example, as major shareholder and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett is committed to maximize shareholder wealth. What he does with his money is his own business. The same holds true for Ramon Ang of San Miguel Corporation, Jaime Sobel de Ayala of the Ayala Group of Companies. University professors like myself are committed to uphold the principle of academic freedom, regardless of our personal beliefs and biases. Now, what corporate owners, their appointed managers, and other personnel do have is the strategic responsibility to serve the interest of the corporation, which is to maximize profit. We draw on insights from the social sciences to support our contention. We refer in particular to two social science theories, the theory of social Darwinism and the theory of social functionalism. Insights from social Darwinism. From the evolutionary viewpoint, all individuals and social institutions, just like their counterparts in the biological world, are driven by self-interest. And consistent with this doctrine is the long-standing economic notion that business firms are motivated solely by profits, and that the most profitable ones have the best chances of survival. The all too familiar phrase, survival of the fittest, was coined by English social philosopher Herbert Spencer. Insights from social functionalism. In line with American sociologist Talcott Parsons' theory of social functionalism, we define the role of the firm in modern society as one of creating economic value. In keeping with the teachings of classical and neoclassical economics, we hold that the lure of profit serves as the most effective motivation for business organizations to serve the interests of society. The goal of profit maximization is a defining tenet of neoclassical economics and has been one of the fundamental ideas behind the emergence of Western capitalism as the dominant form of economic organization. Since the beginning of the 18th century, capitalism has served business and society well. It provided the primary driving force behind the entrepreneurial spirit that led to tremendous technological innovation, the creation of enormous material wealth, and until recently, the eradication of widespread poverty. The near-obsessive preoccupation with shareholder value has also led to unwanted zero or negative sum economic consequences for society and for all other stakeholders in the firm. There is therefore a need to rethink the way we seek maximize profit. The unhampered profit-seeking behavior leads to a number of undesirable consequences. To consumers, it usually results in higher prices, poor quality products, and poor services. To workers, unfairly low wages, poor working conditions. To business partners, unfavorable terms and conditions. To society, environmental degradation, low incomes, and yet unequal opportunities to large segments of society. In other words, these stakeholders tend to lose value, economic value, rather than gain economic value through the firm's efforts to maximize their profits. Now, the ultimate effect of profit-seeking behavior as currently practiced, I have to stress, as currently practiced, is the destruction rather than the creation of potential value. One of the worst anomalies of our times is the ever-widening gap in income and wealth between the very rich and privileged few in most societies and the masses at the bottom of the social pyramid that are mired in abject poverty. According to Oxfam, the richest 1% of the world's population own more wealth than the rest of the world's population, all other people combined. The most recent Forbes report shows a 30% increase in the wealth of the richest Filipinos, 30% in the face of this going on pandemic, while the rest of society has been ravaged by COVID. Corruption and ineptitude in government have been primarily responsible for non-inclusive growth, especially in emerging market economies. Business, too, has been responsible for this unwanted outcome of capitalism. A growing number of progressive business leaders around the world now believe that business itself must take up the challenge to make capitalism more inclusive. Examples include the Business Roundtable's 2019 Statement of Purpose of the corporation, which is to create value for all stakeholders and not just shareholders. The Philippine Business Group's Covenant of Shared Prosperity of 2020, I believe. Yes. And the World Economic Forum's call for stakeholder capitalism. If business is to implement socially beneficial initiatives for the purpose of achieving its long-run strategic goals, it has to radically change the manner in which it does business. In particular, it needs to rethink the way it pursues its profit objective. As an alternative to profit or shareholder wealth maximization as the raison d'etre for the business enterprise, we propose to state the function of the business firm in modern society as one of producing economic value and appropriating the economic wealth created among all the groups that contribute to the production process, including the owners. By implementing appropriate strategies and putting in place governance mechanisms for creating value for its stakeholders, we contend that the residual value that accrues to the owners of the firm, also known as profits, will consequently be maximized. I think this last point is my key message in this presentation. It bears repeating. By implementing appropriate strategies and putting in place governance mechanisms for creating value for its stakeholders, we contend that the residual value that accrues to the owners of the firm will also be maximized. Stakeholder strategies create value for the various stakeholders in the firms in various ways. Creating value for customers through product development, generous prices, and customer care. In reality, value is created by consumers. Or better, value is determined by consumers and not by firms. They decide what is useful to them and the prices that they are willing to pay for them, so-called reservation prices. Creating value for workers by offering comfortable wages, good working conditions, providing them with skills development. According to the efficiency wage theory, paying higher than market wages make workers more productive. Creating value for business partners by establishing a mutually beneficial, trusting relationship with them. Transaction cost economics tells us that establishing a collaborative and trusting relationship with business partners reduces transaction cost. Creating value for the community by addressing the needs of the least privileged members of society and by helping create a sustainable ecosystem. The sustainability of a business is possible only in a sustainable environment. A business environment characterized by a widening gap in the economic fortunes of the very rich and the very poor is unsustainable. This cannot last forever. Continued ecological degradation is unsustainable. This too cannot last forever. It is therefore in the interest of business to address these issues. The resources used by firms to serve the material needs of stakeholders for creating value for their customers, the workers, their business partners, and for the community. These resources are investments intended to maximize long-run output and not costs to be minimized in order to maximize short-run gains. We are here talking about two strategies, one a long-run strategy and the other a short-run strategy, and we explain this by means of a diagram which follows. The diagram that follows show the two alternative strategies that firms pursue to maximize shareholder wealth. One is the common short-run strategy, the other the long-run strategy. The smaller inset shows the result of focusing on immediate results, or short-termism, as in corporate parlance, while the larger portion of the graph shows the outcome of long-run strategies. One, the former, is the result of competitive strategies, while the other is implemented through collaboration to bring the complementary assets of all stakeholders together. One creates value for shareholders at the expense of others. The other by sharing resources with them. One destroys potential value, while the other enhances potential value. Observe that the slices of the pies that go to the shareholders differ in their absolute sizes. It is obviously smaller with short-run strategies and larger with long-run strategies, where the firm seeks to get as much share as it can by creating a much bigger pie, rather than by grabbing as much as it can from a fixed-sized pie, as is usually the practice. I would now want to put all of my points together and have a look at the big picture using this diagram. The interactions and interdependencies in creation and its allocation in society is a very complex one. To simplify, we highlight four major components, as shown by these four boxes, A, B, C, and D. In A, firms produce value by acquiring resources from others. They provide value for the owners of these resources, who are their stakeholders, by purchasing the resources from them at prevailing market prices, through bargaining, by haggling with them and trying to get the best deal possible. And finally, through the implementation of stakeholder strategies as we define it, for the purpose of enhancing productivity. If we take A and B together, look at A and B together. This shows the social functionalist view, which is in keeping with the classical economist definition of the firm as a producer of value. The firm's role in society is to maximize output. And this relationship is defined by what is known as the production function, so familiar to all of us who have studied economics. Taken in isolation, the movement from A to C shows the Friedman doctrine, which is firms create value in order to maximize profit or shareholder wealth. The movement from A to D shows the unintended external effects of the activities of firms, which is taken to mean by many that creating value for society is a social responsibility of business. It has the ethical responsibility, so to speak, to serve the needs of society, which the title of this webinar seems to suggest. Our position is that firms have no such responsibility. The gist of my presentation is that firms can provide socially beneficial results by maximizing shareholder wealth. Doing so, however, by creating value for all stakeholders, and not at their expense. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our conversation in the open forum.
Thank you very much, Dr. Poblador. Yeah, that was a very illuminating discussion. You seem to be on the same page, though, with Mr. Usman. So
we are, as a matter of fact, I am on the same page as everybody else, except for a majority of business practitioners. And my presentation was actually meant to be addressed to them. Yes.
Okay, we'll jump into that later. In the meantime, we would like to have on Ms. April Lee Tan. She's the first Vice President for Corporate Strategy and Chief Investor Relations Officer of Call Financial. She is also the company's Chief Equity Strategist, writing and presenting market strategy reports and appearing in local business programs as a resource person for stock market matters. Previously, she headed Call's research team, which covers more than 60% of the PSE's market capitalization. Outside of Call Financial, April writes the weekly column Intelligent Investing for the Philippine Daily Inquirer and hosts the TV show Insight with April Lee Tan for ANC, both of which focus on the stock market, business, and personal finance topics. She received her BS Management Engineering degree from the Ateneo de Manila University. April became a CFA charter holder in 2000. I personally requested for April through a friend because I felt that her views, knowing how the market thinks, is very vital in this conversation, given what McKinsey and Company has said, that stakeholder values have now become the ethical good, and given what Mr. Ahmed also said, that they actually add value shareholder value, not just the long-term one, the short-term one as seen with the stock prices. So April, please take the floor on the screen in this case.
Okay, so thank you very much for that, Dr. Gonzales. So good morning to Dr. Orbeta, Mr. Ahmed, Dr. Poblador, and Attorney Villanueva, and all the attendees of this webinar and PIDS. So based on what I see, I also believe that a stakeholder model will foster both economic and corporate growth in a post-COVID environment, because I think that is the question in everybody's mind. I do agree that this is easier said than done. It's like world peace, no? Very Miss Universe type of answer that I would say. For example, I know that a lot of MSMEs here are probably whispering behind our backs that, adopting a stakeholder model means having more costly operations, okay? Because you have to make the quality of your products excellent and truthful to your claims. You cannot lie, even if the customers cannot validate if your products are really, of the said quality that you claim it to be. Raw material costs more expensive because you only buy from ethical suppliers who pay the right taxes. And employees paid fairly and pay the proper taxes. And, because of this, in some ways, if you're an MSME, it's hard to be profitable. And I really talk to a lot of people, a lot of MSMEs that say, if we pay the proper taxes, we cannot compete with our competitors because they don't pay taxes. And the tax rate in this country is very high. That's virtually everything, if you think about it, no? But that said, why am I still thinking, notwithstanding the fact that, pragmatically knowing all of this, why do I still say that adopting a stakeholder model is important in building businesses? Well, I think, even if you're a small business, if you want to build a business that will last beyond the next generation, that will last for hundreds of years, which is, I think, the goal of every business owner, you can't only focus on profits in the short term because, yeah, sure, you'll earn a lot of profits in the short term, but you will have a difficult time growing and creating scale over the long term. Think about it. If you cheat your customers or you don't give them good service, it will be hard for you to get repeat customers because you will keep on having to rely on new customers. And anecdotally, based on my experience, I've been an analyst since the 1990s. And I have observed that a lot of companies that have grown, maybe, when they were young, their governance wasn't as good, for example, or the quality of products, weren't as good as they were. But as they were growing, I noticed that they were becoming more concerned about the quality of their products, the welfare of their employees, because it's hard for you to keep on growing your sales if you have to keep on relying on new customers and the quality of your product is not good. So, and aside from that, think about it. If you only have to rely on, say, family members to grow your business and you can't talk to good people because you're not willing to pay them, how big can you become, right? For example, I work for COL Financial and we have more than 400,000 customers right now. But one of the reasons why we have grown as big as we have, notwithstanding the fact that there are so many competitors, is because we have happy customers that refer family and friends to us. That's our biggest source of new accounts. So that's our experience. And another thing, businesses that are so focused on profits but don't want to pay taxes actually have less sources to access capital. We actually have a sister company that does advisory for companies that want to potentially go public. And one of the things we ask them, are you willing to pay the proper taxes? Are you willing to declare your profits? And unfortunately, a lot of them are not willing to do that. But you think about it, If a lot of businesses are very capital intensive, and if you are able to access the stock market, and if you're able to access cheap funding, then you will have an automatic advantage. So just to give everybody an example that they can relate to, one of the best performing stocks in the stock market since I would say 2019 up to today is AC Energy. Okay. And this stock is it's a renewable energy stock, and it's trading at 30 times PE. It's a power company. It's trading at 30 times PE, but you have um, a lot of um, power companies trading at lower valuations, some even below 10 times PE, 13. So at 30 times PE, that's like a cost of equity of around or an earnings yield of 3%. Okay. So, what did AC Energy do with this particular advantage of a very cheap cost of capital? Of course, it went on a buying spree and bought a lot of power plants and grew to such a big company to the point that it's now an index member. And if you think about power companies, you wouldn't say that the Ayalas are, you know, um, one of the experts, they've been in the business for a very long time. That's not true. They're a relative newcomer. But just because they were in renewable energy and, they have the branding of the Ayala, they have this cheap cost of capital. And with that strength of the good name and the focus on renewables, they're able to acquire. And in fact, one of the strategies is to partner with smaller businesses that are in renewable but don't have a brand, don't have that cheap cost of capital. So, that's how they grow. So, that's really an amazing story if you think about it. That just because you have that name and that focus on, doing good things, you are able to grow so fast and, help other people. And, aside from that, right now there are a lot of professionally managed funds, especially foreign funds, that are increasingly investing in companies that adopt ESG practices in their day-to-day operations. They care more about ESG. And contrary to popular belief, adopting ESG leads to positive corporate financial performance. And there are actually studies, which is why more fund managers are analyzing ESG policies. So I think in the past, I think governance, they're more focused on, say, the board composition to make sure that the policies are favorable to minority shareholders, which is what most of us are when we invest in the stock market. But increasingly right now, fund managers and investors are talking about environmental and social policies because um, I mean, a lot of the clients do care more about these issues. So how can they raise capital if, they are not investing in companies that also practice good ESG policies, no? And well, on the practical side, I mean, just doing practicing ESG policies help the PNL. Aside from the fact that there are studies that show it, I think the most important argument at this point is risk management. Okay. Um, because okay, they did a survey, and I think a lot of people, well, yeah, let's do ESG, but they kind of don't know how to adopt it. But when asked the question in a survey of fund managers and investors, do you think ESG will be more important in the future? 75%, around 75% said yes, definitely. It will be more relevant in the future. And people are aware of that. And from a risk management perspective, think about it. In the future, when the government comes out with policies, most likely than not, they will be um, coming out with policies that talk about environmental protection, social protection. So if you're already doing the right things, then your operations will be and your profits will be less vulnerable to these regulations. So in a way, it kind of manages your risk, right? And for us in the stock market, like investors don't like the idea that, you know, you made your projections, and then all of a sudden there will be this negative government policy that would negatively affect the you know, earnings and then the share price of the stock. So in closing, just think about this. What is the reason why a company like Tesla can be valued so much more than traditional car companies? I'm not saying that Tesla is cheap, okay, but you know, it just goes to show you that there is really a greater appreciation of you know, ESG in the market. And, you know, one of the greatest benefits of being aligned with ESG is the low cost of funding that, of course, companies can take advantage of.
Thank you, April. So yeah, those are a number of new things we need to discuss. Dr. Poblador already talked about inequity. You talked a bit about inequity sort of between, you know, the affordability of being ethical, uh, uh, comparing SMEs and comparing large corporations that can do that. And also, you talked about the government being one of actually the stakeholders that seems to be, you know. So I don't know, maybe the CREATE bill will help what you just said, address what
Yeah,
the
that
problem.
should, no, because of the lower rate,
Yeah,
especially for the MSMEs, because the rate
yeah.
goes down to 20%. No?
Yeah, so yeah, hopefully. And so in changing, if we do want to change from, you know, shareholder to stakeholder capitalism, the laws will have to change. And I think our next panelist may give us, since I'm not a lawyer, may give us a better insight on how can that happen? Will that happen? Is that happening? It seems that I'm not sure if it's happening or not because our laws have stakeholderism all over it now, right? So let me introduce my next speaker. Attorney Cesar L. Villanueva is currently the chairman of the Institute of Corporate Directors Board of Trustees. He also holds the position of Executive Secretary for the Administrative Tribunal of the Asian Development Bank, to which post he was first appointed in 2011. He served as Dean of the Ateneo de Manila Law School from 2004 to 2011 and remains a professorial lecturer in corporation law, agency and trust, partnerships and joint ventures, and law and sales. Attorney Villanueva was the recipient of the Ambassador Cesar B. Bautista Award for Good Governance. On May 2014, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Merit by President Benigno Aquino in June 2016 for outstanding dedicated work and exceptional leadership as the chairman of Governance Commission for GOCCs. Dean Villanueva obtained his Bachelor of Laws degree from the Ateneo Law School in 1981 as valedictorian, obtained his Master's of Law from Harvard. He has authored leading legal books in commercial law, Philippine corporate law, Philippine corporate governance. His last book, I think, was awarded the 2009 National Book Award on Professions given by the National Book Development Board and the Manila Critics Circle. Please take the screen, attorney.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzales. I would like to request that my PowerPoint be uploaded. Good morning, everybody. I have been asked to share with you my thoughts and insights on the upgrading of the capitalist system of a developing country like the Philippines, discussing in particular the institutional environment in which stakeholder capitalism can flourish. The previous speakers have looked at the economic and financial side of corporate governance, stakeholder capitalism. My presentation would focus on the corporate governance reforms undertaken in our jurisdiction. First, the background. Next slide, please. Most of you are aware that corporate governance reforms to pursue stakeholder capitalism in our corporate sector began in April 2002, when our Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, promulgated the original Code of Corporate Governance, which focused on, and I quote, the board's responsibility to foster the long-term success of the corporation and secure its sustained competitiveness in a manner consistent with its fiduciary responsibility. Under the original code, corporate governance prompts boards and management of publicly held companies to exercise their business judgment in the best interest of the corporation and its shareholders, but with a clear injunction that every director assumes certain responsibilities to different stakeholders who, under that code, are given the right and therefore the legal standing to expect that the institution, the corporation, is run in a prudent and sound manner. Next slide, please. Eventually, the SEC upgraded the original code with the Code of Corporate Governance for publicly listed companies, which took effect in early 2017, and the Code of Corporate Governance for public companies and registered issuers, which took effect in early 2020. And both codes center their concept of corporate governance towards sustainability and maximizing the shareholders' value, but made it an integral component of the board's and management's responsibility to fulfill the organization's long-term economic, moral, legal, and social obligations towards their shareholders and other stakeholders. What is directly connected with our main topic today of ethical business is that the system of corporate governance under the SEC's code provide for, and I quote, ethical guidelines to hold the board of directors and senior management accountable for ensuring ethical behavior and reconciling long-term customer satisfaction with shareholder value, but to the benefit of all stakeholders and society, much in the light of how Dr. Poblador discussed it. Next slide, please. What the public may well be aware of is that the SEC's codes of corporate governance are founded on the comply or explain approach that combines voluntary compliance with mandatory disclosure. Under the comply or explain approach, companies do not have to comply with the codes, but they must state in their annual corporate governance reports whether they comply with the code provisions, identify any areas of non-compliance, and explain the reasons for non-compliance. It must be noted that no sanctions are imposed for non-compliance with the provisions of the code except for failure to file with the SEC the annual corporate governance report. Now, the rationale for the comply or explain approach is based on the principle that the boards and managements of publicly held companies are in the best position to promote and put in place the best corporate governance regime in their particular companies. They know their industry better than the SEC, so to speak. But more importantly, the comply or explain approach is founded on the abiding belief that the market, the shareholders, investors, and other stakeholders are in the best position to judge and act upon the explanations given by their boards and management on why they cannot comply with the recommendations and guidelines given under the codes. After all, non-compliance with the recommendations and guidelines are not supposed to amount to an unlawful behavior, but merely amount to non-adoption of the corporate governance best practices, especially when the boards and management can well show that such recommendations really are not best suited to their particular companies. Next slide, please. We now go to the main topic. The enactment in February 2019 of the revised Corporation Code finally saw the statutory rendition of our corporate governance reforms. They have been made permanent because they're now part of the written statutory law, which were previously pursued by the SEC using its broad quasi-legislative powers. The revised Corporation Code does not define its concept of corporate governance, but constitutes the SEC as the primary regulatory agency to promote and evolve our corporate governance system that would be in tune with our particular societal circumstances, but always consistent with international best practices. In other words, corporate governance under the revised Corporation Code is what the SEC defines and evolves it to be, within the broad framework given under the code itself. And the important question is, what is that broad framework provided for under the revised Corporation Code for its corporate governance regime? Firstly, the code has formally recognized within its corporate framework the special category of corporations whose business enterprises are vested with public interest. Previously, under our corporate governance jurisprudence, the Supreme Court since early 2000 had recognized that corporations vested with public interest, like public utilities, banking institutions, hospitals, and the like, by the very nature of their business enterprise that cater to or affect the public at large, have a social corporate responsibility that infuses upon their boards and management the fiduciary duty of diligence and care, which they must exercise not only for the shareholders, but for the welfare of the public who use their facilities or who are affected by their operations. With the formal recognition of corporations vested in public interest as special corporations for regulation of the SEC, the revised Corporation Code has firmly and permanently placed within its statutory strictures the stakeholder theory. What many in the public may not be aware of is that, in contrast to the comply or explain approach in SEC's Code of Corporate Governance, is that the revised Corporation Code criminalizes failures to comply with its corporate governance provisions in the following manner. Firstly, the code grants the SEC the power to impose administrative sanctions on any violations of its provision. Secondly, the code creates 11 new and specific corporate governance offenses, which it broadly defines as criminally punishable, in contrast to only one specific criminal offense found under the old Corporation Code. Thirdly, the revised Corporation Code has retained its Section 170, that broad criminal sanction imposed on any other violation of the provisions of the code which are not specifically penalized thereof. That's what Section 170. And that's an amazing undertaking, because its counterpart under the old Corporation Code was already declared by the Supreme Court as being violative of the Criminal Due Process Clause because it describes a broad crime which cannot be the basis of criminal punishment. And lastly, the revised Corporation Code expressly provides the imposition of criminal sanction is without prejudice to the imposition of administrative sanction for the very same act. Next slide, please. Let us look at the new 11 defined criminal offenses. Those that appear in red on your screen indicate offenses where it is the corporation itself that is subject to criminal penalty. Namely, and I'll just state a few, the more important ones: corporations, fraudulent conduct of business through fraud, corporations acting as intermediary for fraud, graft, and corrupt practices, corporations engaging intermediaries for graft and corrupt practices. In other words, unlike the old Corporation Code, the revised Corporation Code now recognizes the legal possibility of a corporate criminal who shall suffer directly the criminal sanction imposed. More importantly, a review of the corporate governance malpractices shows that there is clear legislative intent to impose the highest ethical standards among directors, right? And I will, next slide, please. That slide shows that there are two separate crimes sought to be punished, but they're exactly the same act. Next slide, please. That graph also shows that there are two separate crimes of graft and corrupt practices that are sought to be punished separately, but they actually pertain to the same criminal act as defined. And therefore, you will see that there is really an intent on the part of legislature to criminalize, basically, corporate governance malpractices. I pose the question, where do the corporate governance framework of our revised corporations lead our country? Next slide, please. Insofar as the revised corporation code has formally adopted the stakeholder theory in its formal recognition of the corporation's vested in public interest, there seems to be no doubt that the same will go down well with our businessmen and captains of industry. As has been mentioned, in the late 2020, when the pandemic was well on its way, wreaking havoc on our economy, the Philippine Business Group, comprising of more than 20 business associations in the country, signed the Covenant for Shared Prosperity, with vows to raise the welfare of all stakeholders of local businesses and other matters. Truth be told, our society has not looked at capitalists and captains of industries as villains. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic befell us, the Ayalas, the Ang, the Cs, and the Pangilinas of our society were champions of corporate governance practices. And in the midst of the pandemic, they have gone through extraordinary efforts and resources to protect the interests and well-being of their employees, suppliers, and customers. I now go to a summation. Next slide, please. I would like to focus on the regulatory side effects of the overcriminalization of corporate governance under the revised corporation code. There is no doubt that legislative intent under our code is to move away from comply-explain approach to the criminalization approach. Unfortunately, such a shift in corporate governance enforcement mechanism has been pursued under the code in an overly broad and overly criminalized manner, which creates a chilling effect on the entire commercial infrastructure that seeks to promote the use of corporate medium to pursue investments and commercial activities. Next slide, please. Prior to the revised corporation code, the prevailing rule in Philippine corporate law was that if fraud is committed in pursuit of business affairs, it would be the culprit directors, trustees, or officers, or even employees who would be personally and criminally held liable for committing well-defined offenses. The ultimate owners of the corporate business enterprise, the shareholders, were shielded from the consequences of fraudulent acts of the corporate agents. Under the revised corporation code, which seeks to impose the criminal penalties on the corporation itself, it would actually be the innocent shareholders and other investors and other stakeholders who are adversely affected by tagging of the corporation as a criminal. Next slide, please. Ironically, in spite of the fact that among the main objectives in the promulgation of the revised corporation code was to promote the ease of doing business through the corporate medium, its overly broad and overly criminalized enforcement mechanisms have actually created unnecessary unease in doing business through the corporate medium. It impinges upon the exercise of business judgment of boards and management for fear of professional catastrophe. It undermines, therefore, it actually allows opportunities for wily shareholders and even cunning stakeholders to bring what we call decent suits against the directors and trustees as officers, right? Next slide, please. That slide just shows that in the end, it is the SEC who will determine whether such cases nuisance cases will prosper with the prosecutor. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. We must realize that the promulgation of the revised corporation code has ushered in our society a great social commercial experiment, if not a revolution, that seeks to enforce the constitutional principle enshrined in Section 6, Article 12 of the 1987 Constitution in the area of national economy and patrimony. And I quote, "The use of property bears a social function, and all economic agents shall contribute to the common good. Individual private groups, including corporate corporations and similar collective organizations, shall have the right to own, establish, and operate economic enterprises, subject to the study duty of the state to promote distributive justice." You'll notice that stakeholders capitalism is enshrined in our 1987 Constitution. And we are now in a great experiment, so to speak, to determine whether the enforcement in a criminal manner of stakeholders capitalism in our corporate sector will overcome criminal due process rudiments found in our Constitution itself. Thank you for hearing me out.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Attorney Villanueva. Yeah, that's very interesting to know. I have a lot to say about that. To ask, not to say about that, because yeah, having too much of criminalizing some acts, it does. Yeah, I have. It does. It doesn't help. Okay, so I have a lot of questions in the chat box, and I have questions coming in through Viber and through email, and I thought my decade of experience as a journalist would help me now, but there does seem to be a lot of interest in this topic, so I've been sort of deluged with a lot of questions. So I'll stick with the question that is sort of um, most useful. I would like to ask each and every one. So there's movement towards stakeholder capitalism. From your own fields, from your own vantage points, from your own knowledge, do you think this will happen? Can it happen? How can it happen in terms of changing the laws, etc.? In terms of will it do actually make things better? For Mr. Usman, I'm wondering if the success of such a business model, is it highly dependent on having a charismatic leader? Because PayPal does have a charismatic leader. Here in the Philippines, we have companies that also have social purpose that have flourished, and we have also charismatic leaders associated with those companies. Okay, so maybe may I ask Mr. Usman first?
Sure.
Mr. Usman, yeah.
Sure. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah.
Hear me? Okay,
Yes.
great. I'll try to respond to that last part. I mean, certainly, yeah, Dan Schulman, our CEO, is certainly charismatic. But I think one of the interesting points of this discussion is that it's about the corporation, and a corporation is not just a person. That's why you create a corporation, is to you kind of have a separate entity. And so the hope is that even once that person leaves, then the corporation continues to have that approach of stakeholder capitalism. And there's, since we made our shift, Dan has been our leader, and he continues to be our leader. But I think first of all, there's a lot of leaders at PayPal who followed him in his approach. And then secondly, there's another company. I don't know if they have presence in the Philippines, but they're a very well-known company in the United States called Ben and Jerry's. They make ice cream, and Ben and Jerry are obviously the founders, and they have a very stakeholder capitalist approach. But they retired or left the company a couple of years ago, and the company got acquired. But the part of the acquisition by a much bigger company was they get to continue to have this approach. And so while a leader is certainly important, and very much so when a company is making this shift, the whole goal of doing it as a company is so that it lives on beyond the leader once he or she decides to leave.
For Dr. Poblador, I'd like to ask the same question. Do you think there will be a shift? How can you make this happen in the Philippines, for instance? Even noting what let's say April said about practicality, how do you actually operationalize investing in workers, investing in the what you basically talked about in your presentation, Dr. Poblador? Dr. Poblador? I think he lost connection. Did he lose connection? Okay, is he there? Okay, can I turn to April? April, yeah, you talked a lot about practicality and not SMEs not maybe not affording this. And at the same time, it seemed to me you also talked about like an Ayala an Ayala firm profiting from adopting stakeholder values. And is this going to lead to more inequity, so to speak? I mean, if it's the big companies, the name brands who also get to profit from this, in the long run, it's still the equity issue that.
Well, I don't think it's impossible for small firms to eventually make it big. But if you're small and you want to be big, but you don't want to follow the stakeholder model, I think it's going to be more difficult because, at the end of the day, um, you have to, I mean, for example, for um, the shareholders, minority investors, institutional investors, like public money, the reason why they will want to give you money is because, at the end of the day, sorry to say, it's all about profits. Profits as well. So if they don't like what you do, they feel like your business is not sustainable. Okay, so I don't think they will be willing to buy your stock. And, that public money is a big thing. And even, say, the act of borrowing money from the bank. I mean, what if you don't have the proper paperwork? And, of course, you don't issue receipts, right? Because you don't want to pay taxes. So, oh, I want to expand. So, what do you do? Well, maybe you can borrow from informal lenders, but what kind of interest do you pay? So the next step is, okay, let's say your business has grown to a certain level, then you want to go to the bank, want to borrow money. So what is the bank going to ask you? Can you give me your audited financial statements? O tapos, diba? So, the ability to borrow will also be dependent on what you declare, right? And okay, after let's say you get away with borrowing from the bank, or from a small borrower, you pay well, therefore you become a big borrower, etc. The next level is going public because you can't have 100% debt. You have to have a portion of it funded by equity also so that it kind of controls your risk. Again, if you don't have a good track record, how can you actually go to the public and tell them, invest in me, invest in my business. Okay, for example, okay, I'm an analyst, so what are the questions we ask companies? Okay, of course we ask questions like how do you generate your revenues? Like what's the competitive advantage of your product? I mean, you have to say something that's really sustainable over the long term. And if you don't provide quality products, I don't think that's sustainable. Um, well, so and also, I mean, think about it. During this crisis, a lot of restaurants are having problems. But if you actually have access to capital, you're at a huge advantage. For example, Jollibee prior to 2020 had this unfortunate incident where the timing of its purchase of CBTL, so it had to borrow 350 million US dollars. Okay. So that's like a bad timing. You did it in 2019, 2020 you have a pandemic. Like who's gonna buy coffee, right? Because people are not gonna go out. They're just gonna brew their coffee at home, etc. And that business is not profitable. And then you borrowed $350 million. But what happened? I mean, well, the business in the past has been run profitably. They have good quality products. Customers patronize them. Shareholders are happy. It's one of our actually most popular stocks because a lot of the shareholders made money and they have an emotional attachment. So they go and raise capital. They issue prefs at a very cheap cost, and people actually subscribe. So it they benefit from this. But if you're a small company and you have no access to capital and even if you go to the banks, it's so difficult to borrow money at this point, unless maybe you have legitimate papers to show that you can survive. So I think okay, I was thinking about it. How do I explain it in a way that people can understand? And um, it's like ano, I always remember what one of my smoker friends said, because we were telling him, come on, stop smoking, it's bad for you. And you know what he told us? Well, why don't you guys stop eating fatty foods like yung mga lechon, taba ng baboy? Because I mean, think about it, it's the same. If you follow a shareholder model where you think about the profits in the short term, it's like eating like smoking and eating your fatty foods, because you don't see the benefits. The benefits are long term. It's bad, but in the meantime, I want to earn the money, so I'll do it. So, but if you have a long term mindset and you want to be big, you want to earn a lot of money eventually, you're not content with, what you are right now, then you follow that stakeholder model. And unfortunately, a lot of people are very short term. And when you get to the point where, oh, my business can become big, that's the time you realize I should have followed a stakeholder model.
So here in the Philippines, are we observing what Mr. Usman has observed for the U.S., where the market is really, it's really dictated now by the market. You have to have social purpose if you want to have your stock prices, be
Oh yeah, yeah.
rising.
Yeah, you will notice that there are some stocks really that are the favorites of investors. And one of the reasons why is because they follow a stakeholder model. And as I've said earlier, there are a lot of those companies that started small, and maybe their focus on the stakeholder model wasn't clear. But as they were growing, you'd notice that little by little, they were improving that focus away from being very shareholder focused to a more stakeholder focused. Because you have to generate bigger sales, you need more people, you better employees. Um, like this is everybody. Like sometimes I'm like surprised. I didn't expect this company to be talking about this because they're very shrewd, very profit centric. And then all of a sudden, when they did their investor briefing, they kind of talk about environmental issues and social issues. Like, they're trying to change their image, maybe because they wanted to hire better people or encourage more people to buy their products. So I'm seeing more of this. I just don't want to name names. Okay.
So I'd like to ask, is Dr. Poblador back?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. Yeah. I was asking, how do you see it going forward, and how do you operationalize what you just said? I mean, how do you actually, like April said, some companies may not be able to afford to do these things. How exactly do we see it happening business-wise?
Okay. Am I in now?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Okay. Well, actually, my main concern is that stakeholder strategies have been very, very successful. As you will recall from my last diagram, second to the last diagram, it shows that as the slice of the pie becomes bigger and bigger through stakeholder strategies, the absolute amount of the pie that goes to the shareholders is also getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the end result of this is that the distribution of wealth and income in society as well becomes a little somewhat more and more lopsided, and it's getting worse and worse by the by the day. 30% increase in wealth of the wealthiest 20 individuals in the Philippines, as against the suffering of the greater masses of the people, especially due to the pandemic. So I believe that the government should step in. It should it should strengthen its hand at attempting to capture the negative external effects of stakeholder strategies as we recommend. In other words, through its tax policies, its regulatory policies, it can capture value that is otherwise lost. And I think the decision to reduce taxes of big corporations is self-defeating. My own thinking is that taxes, the tax obligations of the very rich should be increased in order to promote a more equitable distribution of wealth and income in society. So the government has to play its role. It cannot be silent, in this very important endeavor. And we cannot leave everything to good, to good intended corporations to alleviate the problems faced by society. The government must play a more active hand.
Okay. Attorney Villanueva, how do we jumping up from that very strong point of Dr. Poblador, may we ask you, we do have a lot of mentions, tags, according to the millennials, of the stakeholder in our corporate governance code. So it's been in and out of the corporate governance code. It was in 2002, out in 2009, in again in 2014, and now we have the newest one for PLCs, publicly listed companies. They actually have sections dedicated to stakeholder, protection of the stakeholder. What do you think is the progression from there on? Are we shifting or are we not? I'm a bit not sure if there is a shift or there isn't.
I think
I'm very honest about it.
Right. Well, for lawyers specifically, and the legal profession, the shift towards the stakeholders theory actually happened with the adoption of our 1987 Constitution. If you look at the ESG goals, protecting women, recognizing private ownership, but having it a social function, protecting the environment, those are all provided for in the policies and provisions of our Constitution. So when we adopted our Constitution, we actually adopted as a nation the ESG goals, but they were not in those terms, but we all know them. And therefore, whether the administrative agencies decide to adopt stakeholders or not, it's written in our Constitution, basically, and the Supreme Court has been at the forefront thereof. Now, even without a code, the Supreme Court has begun to recognize that the stakeholders have the standing to demand that directors and managers act with due care in protecting, making sure that their operations are there. You will recall the OPOSA decision, where the Supreme Court actually, on intergenerational right to a clean environment, actually promulgated a decision that allows them to protect Manila Bay and all of those, right? And those were all based on constitutional provisions that now represent our ESG. So the shift is there, and now the revised corporation code is now trying to scare them to death, so to speak. If you don't do this, this is what's going to happen to you. You have reputational risk. So it's all there, and it has begun to happen even before we adopted our first code of corporate governance.
But the problem, or well, not problem, the main thing that you really need to address is how do you now translate that at the board level? If you're the board, at the board level, how do you actually make your decisions? You have multiple objectives now, whereas before you had one objective, which was to raise profits, and now you have a lot of objectives. And so how do you do it? How do you weight your decisions? I think that's a very difficult problem that really needs to be addressed. I think you have the metrics there to help you, but ultimately you really need to solve it at that level. How do you actually make your decisions? given all these things that you need to fulfill?
Well, basically, that's what the ethical board behavior means. By having ethical boards behave properly, they automatically consider not only profit maximization, they consider the effects that they have on society, on their workers. That's because it's not going to be difficult when you have an ethical board rather than a for-profit board. When an ethical board sits there, it has the wares to become profitable, but at the same time, because it has ethical considerations, it considers the long-term effects. And that is what ethical behavior in the board, and that's what ethical capitalism seeks to promote, which is the center of corporate governance regime.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
So in 2019, for example, the SEC required publicly listed companies, and I don't know if it includes all issuers, to file sustainability reports. So that's it. Then they give you a list of things that you have to talk about. It's quite comprehensive, and being an analyst myself, and also doing investor relations for CUL Financial, my realization is, although yes, you will not be penalized for not complying with certain environmental or social best practices, it kind of raises awareness at the board level, at the management level, like, I can do more. Why am I not doing this? There are easy things that I can do to be more compliant with what is being required. Like, for example, doing a survey among my employees to see if they are happy with their conditions. A net promoter score also among my customers, a survey. So as well, so not only your employees and also among your clients, and also it asks questions like, how many women do you have working for you? Like, then you kind of realize, oh yeah, I haven't been hiring enough women or underprivileged people. I've been focusing too much on this and that. So I think that is a good stepping stone or a start for people to kind of create an awareness that, hey, I can do small things to improve my ESG scores. And I think it's a good thing. But again, I can understand why comply and explain rather than you're required to do it or else, because it's difficult. And there are certain provisions, like we're an online broker. How can we adopt environmentally friendly practices? It's not relevant to us if you think about it. But if you're a manufacturing company, then that's something you can think about. No? So yun lang naman on my part. I think at least, no, I mean, it's so difficult if, puro bawal to, bawal yan, do this, do that. But at least,
the SEC attorney Gumtang, she was here. She talked also part of this event, and she said that this is really market driven. That's why they have complied. They want it really to be market driven, and so the corporations will still be driven by the profit motive to do good. So there are two questions from the chat box for our
Dr.
guest.
Gonzales, can I say something for just a few seconds?
Yeah, sure.
10 seconds, okay?
Yes.
All right. In pursuing stakeholder strategies, corporate decision makers are faced with a multiple set of goals. Now, it is not possible to maximize over several goals at the same time. You must have only one goal, right? Again, which provide the metrics by which the trade-offs between different options can be evaluated. So you must only have one goal, which is, well, profit maximization or shareholder wealth maximization. And from among the options, stakeholder strategy options, you choose the one that will contribute the most to the bottom line, right? So in this way, we reconcile conflicting interests among the different stakeholders. Okay.
Thank you, sir. We have actually two questions from our chat box that come from very esteemed economists. Dr. Fabella, our national scientist, and Dr. Mangajas, one of also our pioneers. So I'd like to read first Dr. Fabella's on implementation of stakeholder capitalism protocols. Where's the stick? Either it's by, sorry, I cannot read it because of all the messages that are coming in. This has generated a lot of interest. I must say I'm very overwhelmed on implementation of, so the question goes on the implementation of stakeholder capitalism protocols. Where's the stick? Either it is voluntary or mandated by the government. If it is voluntary, it is subject to opportunism. Those who renege will prosper at the expense of those who abide. Cooperation must be enforced by the market itself. The enforcement mechanism is the stock market and the open market. Equity investors must punish renegers, but will they if renegers pay higher dividends? If they do, they are trading off personal well-being with social well-being, at least in the short term. They must be socialized to opt for the second rather than the first. In other words, society itself must be socialized to abide by this norm. If society does not subscribe, this will not happen. In other words, the norm of preference for social or public good must be widely shared. There's no stick. The same can be said of consumers if mandated by the government. The government itself must be enlightened rather than predatory and subscribe to the norm. You're already swimming and sinking in the ocean of unenforced and unwise laws. The stick may either be wrong or employed for the wrong ends. On the implementation side, the Friedman rule still stands. So I guess you're saying that we all should be enlightened, all the players for this. So can you react to that what I just read from Dr. Fabella? And then we have another one from Dr. Manahas and another one from our own PIDS economist, Toots Albert, which will I read later. But that one first. How do you respond to that?
May I just share a small thought? Well, when corporate managers make decisions, well, these decisions by themselves are voluntary, but they must be subject to a set of constraints. See, if you rely totally on the market, then we have to realize that markets are reliable. So that's where the state should come in and establish a set of constraints, regulatory constraints, tax measures that will condition the choices made by corporate managers. Decisions while serving the interest of the company, also best serves the interest of society as a whole.
Okay, from Dr. Mangahas, Milton Friedman advocated competitive capitalism over the directed economy because the former assured more freedom for businesses and for individuals. He was anti-monopoly. He would have fought Big Pharma's refusal to share technology with competitors. I comment as one of his students at the University of Chicago in 1965 to 1970. Okay. From Toots Albert, what is the role of regulation and regulators in incentivizing firms, especially conglomerates, to practice more ethical business practices rather than get into rent-seeking behaviors to maximize their corporate profits and greed? What can be done given that legislators and those in the executive often go into collusion with big firms?
That's right.
That's the rules of the game. Would like to answer this? Or should we just?
Well, I think I have what I said earlier is relevant here. The state should flex its muscles. The state should come in to intervene and set the constraints that would direct corporate decision makers to make choices that are the most beneficial to society. We cannot rely on competition alone, on the market forces alone, because they are so unstable and unreliable. The state must play a major role in this increasingly complex business environment. We cannot rely entirely on on the good intentions of progressive corporate leaders. The state should come in, and it should come in strong. So I am an advocate of a strong government.
Dr.
Not
Gonzales?
today. I am an advocate of a strong government, strong but enlightened. All right, they are not enlightened. So in the ultimate analysis, the voters must come in. They should choose leaders of government who are enlightened, not leaders who are of the type that we have right now. So a change of
Yes, Attorney Villanueva.
a change of government leadership is essential.
Attorney
That is a
Villanueva.
political decision, of course.
Attorney Villanueva, yes.
Yeah, to the point of Dr. Albert, the answer to that is we must, as a nation, determine to elect only good leaders, political leaders, and to vote into boards only good capital leaders. So I think that's what we need to do. Until we do that, we will be beset until our politics is improved, both private, public politics. To the point of Dr. Mangas, if you look at the Code of Corporate Governance for publicly listed companies, as well as for publicly held public companies and registered, you look at them, and it still contains what Dr. Poblador says. The main goal of the boards and management of publicly held companies is still the maximization of shareholders' profit, but always with due regard for the interest of the stakeholders and the nation as a whole. But it still says that when you go about as agents or fiduciaries of the shareholders, you must pursue the corporate enterprise with due regard for making it operate, because profits to the company is more taxes to the government and more benefit, more employment. But when you do so, it must always be considering the interests of the nation and other stakeholders, which is ethical behavior, right? And that's what you see. And to a great extent, the Friedman doctrine is still there. And in fact, it is consistent with the Friedman doctrine. And to the point of the first one.
Dr. Fabella.
That's
Dr.
right.
Fabella.
Yeah, Dr. Fabella. Very good point. And basically, I have said in other talks that if you look at the stakeholder provisions now, the codes of corporate governance on one hand by the SEC and the revised corporation code on the other hand, also administered by the SEC, you now have a bipolar approach. You have a bipolar approach to corporate governance encroachment. When the SEC talks about codes of stakeholder capitalism in its codes, it is comply or explain. It is trying to invite the boards to say, look at this, be aware of the effects that you have, be aware of the fact that when you protect the environment or you protect your employees and you pursue stakeholders' interests in addition to pursuing the bottom line, you actually sustain a better but at the same time, if you misbehave, if you don't get the message, the SEC turns around and says, well, under the revised corporation code, we can hold you administratively sanctionable. Now, when it addresses that, when it uses its administrative sanction under the revised corporation code, it is addressed to a particular evil company. But when it addresses, it looks at the industry as a whole, it talks with comply or explain. It talks with encouraging. It talks of saying, change your hearts and minds to this because it's good for you. So you have a bipolar approach now, but I think that that's the best approach that we can do. When it talks to the industry as a whole, it is a benign, it's a well-motivated SEC. And that's how you do. There's a carrot and there's a stick, so to speak.
Yeah, sir, but in a market-driven approach where the market drives businesses to do good, my own comment at that is, but our corporations are not really opening up that much for the market to actually have a real impact in how. I mean, we have a set amount, like we said, 10% should to be listed, but not all firms are listing. They up that to 20%, but that's still not enough for minority shareholders to get together and really make a difference in the stockholder voting. So how should there be more reforms in that direction for wider participation of the public in the companies that have grown very big? That's I think one important element if you want the market to drive the corporations.
Dr.
Can I
Gonzales,
add?
can I come in with just with one minor thought, just for 10 seconds again, on monopolization? But Dr. Manga has mentioned the government's role in controlling monopolies. Now, in today's economy, knowledge or human capital has become the most important resource, right? And human capital, or rather knowledge, that particular resource, is subject to increasing returns. The more of it is available to the corporation, to the firm, the more productive it becomes, right? So the larger it is, the more productive it becomes. So it is in the benefit of society to encourage bigness up to a point. So that's another anomaly that I find in our situation. To what point will we allow bigness to prevail? Again, the government must set up strict requirements, strict constraints to control the behavior of monopolies, but still allowing them to operate on a large scale. Yes, thank you.
April?
Yeah.
Attorney?
Yeah. I just wanted to add about that. As you've mentioned, and I agree that there are not many listed companies. So how can the market really do anything when there are a lot of? I mean, most of the companies are private, so they can just do whatever they want, right? The market will not, or the public cannot do their vote of confidence, so to speak. So I guess we do hope that there will be more education for private companies to encourage them to list. I think one of the favorable developments that we're seeing is the PSE has relaxed the listing rules. But then again, a lot of private companies are not aware of the benefits of being listed. So they really are not going public. And aside from that, I think investor education is also very important for them to know how to, I think, evaluate and scrutinize good companies, what types of companies they should avoid, so that they will know, they will reward companies that are run well, that also focus on the stakeholders. So yeah.
Okay. There's a question from the chat box from BSP, from Jed Santo Domingo of BSP. BSP is one of our partners in this event. There are strong crowdfunding platforms in the West, such as Seed Invest in the US and Crowdcube of the UK. These essentially allow venture capitalism for everyone at more affordable minimum investment amounts, and a chance to support only startups socially relevant to the investor. What are the panelists' thoughts on such platforms in relation to today's theme? Are there similar platforms on the horizon in the Philippines? Maybe we can ask Mr. Usman. Is Mr. Usman still around?
Yeah.
Or he left now.
Certainly don't have thoughts on the Philippines market, and we'll leave that to others in terms of some of these startups. But yeah, I mean, I think April and others have mentioned certainly, being able to invest in something puts you at a different kind of capacity to influence what the market is doing. But I also just want to take a step back on a lot of the comments that have been made to just inject this notion that, I said corporations are entities, but they're entities made up of people, and people get to make choices. It's not, we don't live in a determined world. It's not a computer. We all get to choose what we want to do. And if we start choosing that we're going to shop from companies that care about climate, and invest in companies that care about employees, and create policies and government structures that incentivize companies that make good social choices, it's going to happen. Like, we can set up a world that actually moves towards that direction. But if we just think that, people are going to be short-termism and only look at their, next quarterly gain, then that's what's going to happen. We all get to make a choice, I think, as to what happens on this, and that's why it's exciting. And I know we're almost at time, but this has been a great discussion. It's really fun to think about and talk about.
So it was a great discussion. On that note, it was really a great discussion. I'm sort of, in Tagalog, we call it biten. Biten meaning I want more time, but I don't have more time. So I would like to ask for parting words from each of our speakers and panelists. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom, your ideas with us. We really appreciate it. And we would like to give you a few minutes each just to give your final thoughts on the subject. Let's start with you, Mr. Usman, in the order that we gave our presentations. Mr. Ahmed.
Yeah. No, just I think I already said it, that I'm a big believer in people and people's ability to do the right thing and do good things. I'm just appreciative of the opportunity to come and engage with you all on this super interesting topic. So thank you so much.
Dr. Poblador.
Okay, I think I mentioned in parting in my presentation that the gist of my presentation is that firms can provide socially beneficial results, but this can be done by maximizing shareholder wealth. Doing so, however, in such a way that it creates value for all participants in the production process. Allocate value to its workers, to its business partners, customers, and to the community as a whole, in order to achieve its goal of maximizing shareholder wealth, and in the process, contributing maximally to society as well. So it's the duty of the firm is not really to produce value for society as such, but rather to produce value for its shareholders. However, choosing decision criteria that would also maximize the benefits to society. And in many cases, collaborative action is required. And in some cases, the strong arm of the government is also needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Poblador. April?
Okay. Yeah, so I guess in summary, I'd like to say that, the stakeholder model works, although unfortunately in the short term, it's easier to follow a shareholder model because the profits are immediate, the benefits are immediate. However, over the long term, a stakeholder model is more profitable. And I hope that that's something that businesses will think about a lot. And I also encourage businesses to pursue a public listing, which will help them grow and will also benefit minority shareholders, especially if you are already following a stakeholder model anyway. It will benefit you all the more.
Thank you, April. Attorney Villanueva.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzales. I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown to us is that the power now is ultimately back into the market. And if we think of the market as the stakeholders, the consumers, the social media people, media online, the power of the click itself has now shown that the market can make big companies and big companies responsive. They can bring them a private company that's big by the fact that social media says that something is wrong. And now that's the market now will drive this. And whether big corporations tend to care about the stakeholder capitalism, it is there because The internet has provided all the stakeholders around the world, in whatever capacity they are, media, consumers, analysts, to be able to make them behave because of the power to reach almost everybody. That's the news in corporate governance front. The power of the market has come back to really enforce and make effective the stakeholder capitalism. Those who refuse to acknowledge it, refuse to behave by it, well, they go by the wayside. That's what's going to happen.
Thank you very much. Thank you for ending on that very hopeful note. This is a continuing conversation, and it will continue for years and years and years. It has been going on for decades even. And so, yeah, we will be here with you to continue that conversation. So before we end our webinar, we have some announcements. The presentations you heard today can be downloaded from the PIDS website. Just go to the events section. You may also download the files from the DPRM website. Please help us improve our webinars by answering the survey that will pop up on your screen when you leave the meeting room. Your feedback is important to us. Be updated on the latest PIDS knowledge resources and forthcoming events. Just follow us on our website and our social media accounts. The URLs are on the screen. Thank you for joining the first two of our four-part webinar series for this year's Annual Public Policy Conference, or APPC. We have two more APPC webinars which will happen next week on September 21. We'll talk about green and inclusive recovery, and on September 23, we'll discuss robust and healthy workforce. The closing program will immediately follow after webinar 4. For more information about this year's celebration, simply visit the website that's on your screen. It contains everything that you need to know about our celebration this year. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, sorry. Finally, we would like to thank all the agencies from the government, private sector, academe, civil society, and media that joined us today. You can see the names of these entities on the screen. We also appreciate the participation of our Facebook viewers and those who followed the live tweets of this webinar via our Twitter page. We look forward to seeing all of you again on September 21 and 24 for webinars 3 and 4 of our APPC webinar series. Thank you and blessed day to all.